In the paper Rebel Becomings, Querying School Spaces with Young People, published in the book Schools as Queer Transformative Spaces, Dr. Leanne Cole writes, "For the past 20 years or more, educational researchers have drawn on queer and feminist theoretical tools to deconstruct dominant heteronormative landscapes of schooling. Many have focused attentions towards the overt and subtle ways in which rigid cisgender and heterosexual norms permeate school spaces and underpin various gender sexualities-based regulation, policing and harassment, in ways that have complex material effects. This body of work has persistently highlighted how heteronormativity is so embedded within school experiences that many young people, teachers and members of school communities accept it without questioning its implications. Most recently, scholars have drawn our attentions to the queer and transformative potentials of schooling. In doing so, they emphasize how interrogating heteronormativity and actively responding to inequalities is not something that only adults, researchers, educators do. Young people themselves are also active agents in deconstructing, interrogating and disrupting cisgender and heterosexual norms that permeate their everyday lives and schooling experiences. It is impossible to ignore the increasing role that queer and feminist activism is playing in schools. Programs and resources such as Agenda Wales are some international examples of how explicit post-structural queer and feminist new materialist frameworks are being used in schools to queer school spaces and educational experiences. The references to the terms deconstruct and post-structural indicates the influence of the writings of postmodernist philosopher Jacques Derrida on RSE pedagogy within Wales. Jacques Derrida was one of the most well-known 20th century philosophers. He developed a strategy called deconstruction in the mid-1960s. Although not purely negative, deconstruction is primarily concerned with something tantamount to a critique of the Western philosophical tradition. Deconstruction is generally presented via an analysis of specific texts. It seeks to expose and then to subvert the various binary oppositions that undergird our dominant ways of thinking, presence, absence, speech writing, and so forth. In her 2005 book, Girls, Boys and Junior Sexualities, Professor Emma Renold quotes academic Richard Johnson. Queer theory is linked to forms of politics which deliberately seek to break down the fixed boundaries between the hetero-homo, gender and other binaries, to multiply sexual categories and ultimately dissolve them. Post-structuralists see gender categories as oppressive because they are so closely linked with gender stereotypes. For them, it is an ethical practice to break down these binary oppositions, which they regard as liberating. The post-structural movement of queer theory is a new religion.
A lot of this work has involved designing and drawing upon creative methods for children and young people to safely communicate the issues that matter to them, and then to ensure that their views are heard and shared and acted upon. And one of the moments I've been most proud of was to distill this creative praxis into the Agenda resource and website. So this little film you see behind me captures one of the case studies in the resource of children writing on rulers and ribbons and kites what they want to change to make gender equality and justice matter and fly. And over the last 3 years, we've been sharing this creative praxis in an innovative professional learning programme for teachers in Wales who are preparing for the new statutory relationships and sexuality education curriculum, a curriculum which I continue to have the privilege to inform and shape. And it's a resource and a creative and ethical praxis that's having a significant international reach in the field of RSE, from Finland to Australia. But it started and it has become embedded here in Wales.
This movement has united in opposition both atheists and Christians. In conversation with the author of The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins, Helen Joyce explains.
The only sense in which a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man is by saying so. It's a speech utterance. And so I've come to see, I think there are many things happening here. There's things happening in medicine, in politics. But one of the things that's happening is a long run, maybe 2 or 3 century move towards seeing categories and classification as inherently oppressive. So people think, heteronormative is a bad thing, or they think that, the traditional family is constraining. And they miss the point that these things often, like when I say evolved, I don't mean like evolutionary biology. I mean that they came to be over significant amounts of time for a reason, and they're supportive as well as constraining. But everything that's structured or categorized or named or classified, that's now seen as something imposed upon people. So somebody like Judith Butler, for example, who's the queer theorist who wrote Gender Trouble, which is kind of the foundational text that academia uses when looking at these issues, says that gender is an imitation for which there is no original. That she doesn't see sex. She says sex is socially constructed and gender is the real thing. And there isn't any foundation for gender. It's just something that's made meaningful by performing it over and over again. Now, I hadn't come across this at university. As I say, I studied mathematics. And I spent my time proving theorems and defining my terms very carefully. So I was blissfully ignorant of the fact that significant numbers of young people are being taught this sort of nonsense. But they come out of it thinking that somebody who says, look, there are 2 sexes and the sex that you are is the sex that you were conceived as, they think that what you're doing is imposing social roles on them. So I was brought up to think that what was liberatory and what was progressive was to say, well, this little person is a girl. Let's not let her stop. Let's not let that stop her doing anything. She could be an astronaut. She could be president.
Quite. I mean, I think we were all sort of, when I was brought up to think that you could do whatever you wanted to. You have the power to, as you said, be an astronaut, be whatever you damn well like. And it's as though this trend now is reverting to stereotyped girls like pink and boys like blue and boys like playing with Meccano sets and girls like playing with dolls. And it's a stereotyping which I kind of revolt against, and yet it seems to be increasingly fashionable.
Absolutely, and it's worse than just the old-fashioned stereotyping that would have said, look, this child is definitely a boy, and if he doesn't like rugby and so on, well, he's a pufter, and let's bully him. It's now saying he's actually a girl.
Yes.
So, there's the pink and the blue boxes have been restructured and remade and reinforced, and a child who doesn't fit into the one that's for the sex that they were, inverted commas, assigned at birth, we have to pop them into the other one. And if you call them out on this, they say, no, that's gender expression, that's gender roles you're talking about. We're talking about gender identity, which is a sort of a posited, innate knowing that you pop into the world with. But nobody pops into the world knowing that sort of thing about themselves. Children learn it from the stereotypes. They self-examine and match themselves against the stereotypes. So now we say to little, what you used to call a sissy boy, that little boy now thinks that he's meant to be a girl. And teachers may say that's not what I'm telling him, but it is what they're telling him.
Christian academic Dr. Scott Masson explains that the term deconstruction is used in different ways.
Because when you ask what deconstruction is, there are a whole multitude of answers. One of them is that it's a way of doing philosophy. Some see it as a way of reading texts, a theory. Some think it's just a fashionable approach and is past its best before date now and is no longer used. R.V. Young says that that's the view in the academy. Some think that it's a recapitulation of skepticism and irrationalism. Some see it as a dead end, the dead end outcome of ideas that began in German idealism, which I think is a little bit perhaps closer. Some see it as a neo-Heideggerianism. Heidegger is, by Derrida, cited as his formative influence, his idea of language being the house of being, etc. Some see it as an ethical response to a complacent establishment. Some see it as a sustained assault on the Western philosophical tradition. And more recently, some see it as an attack on Christianity. Very popular in our day, I understand, to talk about the deconstruction of the Christian faith.
Derrida argued that Western thought was logocentric. Using Young's book, At War with the Word, as a resource, Masson argues that Derrida undermines a common understanding of what it is to be human.
First point he raises is that deconstruction is used within the academy for the purpose of destroying the tradition, the great books, the idea of Western culture, Western civilization is deconstructed in the 1960s, seized upon gleefully for its political social agenda and its effectiveness in doing this. And it's predicated, as Derrida says, on being applicable to the entirety of Western thought, as always, because he says that the Western tradition privileges the oral over the written, which is manifestly false. However, to repeat myself, there is a tradition of the humanities that does arise where the oral is privileged over the written, and that is the 18th century project of attributing human language as the subject of human study, and then extending that through the course of time in anthropology, seeing it as a group phenomena sociologically or even internally in psychology, where the mind is the central focus of study. There, the vocal or the oral tradition is more important. It's more important what I feel and what I think than what I say or what I write down. That tradition is subject to Derrida's anti-logocentrism. So I see him as a double-edged sword that destroys the human sciences. Because it does fall prey to the problem that he identifies here. So let's trace the argument out here a little bit. And I'm going to read extracts from Young for the purposes of people that aren't here, but just to refresh your memories as well, page 32. Pursued to its logical conclusion of illogicality, of nihilistic chaos, deconstruction will only succeed in canceling itself out along with everything else. That's what we've just argued. That's the problem. However, postmodernists have learned to live with cognitive dissonance and apply the solvent of deconstruction only to the ideas of their perceived enemies. It's a useful tool. We'll continue to wield the tool. We will say that your words and your appeals to reason are just Western, or they're patriarchal, or they're racist. We'll continue to use that vocabulary and say that we can't talk about any of these things because of this hermeneutic of suspicion applied to everybody else's assertions that we don't like. But we're going to ignore that the view of language that we have brought forward also has to bite and affect our own view of language. If I'm attacking the patriarchy, then I'm effectively representing the matriarchy, if you will. If I'm attacking a white view of the world, then I'm privileging a black view of the world. Whatever those terms mean, because I think they're both nonsensical terms. But as he says, such is the impeccable logic of deconstructive illogic, the idea of Western civilization is hollow, because deconstruction shows that all conceptions are self-contradictory. But since the concept of deconstruction is itself contradictory, it can be happily ignored when its implications prove inconvenient for our own favorite ideals. Although deconstruction has lost some of its prominence and luster in the academic world, it remains, as Stanley Fish intimates, indispensable for the flourishing of postmodernism. Indispensable. So we must not get rid of the tool of deconstruction. We must continue to wield it against our enemies, lest they arise up again, and we have to keep on killing them. So, and as he notes in a concluding statement, there is irony here insofar as deconstruction entails reveals the emptiness of the postmodern project even while making it possible. So postmodernism is a wholly negative project. It builds nothing. It destroys only. It is anti-logocentric. But with this, I'm arguing it's also anti-humanistic. It attacks the idea that there's a common human nature, and it must do so. Because our view of the logos entails what it means to be a human being. But if we have no common humanity, then we have no common language, we have no common reasoning, then the academy is engaging in various language groups talking about themselves in ways that are irrational or incomprehensible to other groups. And so, although the university begins as a pursuit of knowledge, or an articulation of what knowledge means, because God holds all things together in himself, and there's a unity to that knowledge in Christ, in the logos. Now there is no logos holding it all together, and things just fall apart. And including the concept of human nature, that falls with it. So the idea of personhood collapses.
Former head of Stonewall, Ruth Hunt, is a practicing Catholic, and she comes from Cardiff. She studied Butler at university. In an interview with The Guardian, she stated, "We always knew it was going to be rough, but I knew the organisation well enough to do this and how to do it quickly. There is a group of people who believe trans women are men, and there is nothing that will change that. There is a group of people who believe trans women are trans women, and it's all a bit puzzling. Can we have a chat about it? And there's a group that think trans women are women, and that's the camp Stonewall supporters are in. The logos, or universal reason, is a unifying principle that brings people together. But this statement is a rejection of the logos. It is divisive. So what does Ruth Hunt have to say to those women who believe that a woman is an adult human female? She has 3 words. Get over it. Masson sees people like Ruth Hunt as representing a new priesthood.
So the anti-logocentrism, which is what Derrida's movement then gets called by other critics, an anti-logocentrism, I am going to say is something we can apply to the human sciences. But it has no bearing on what Christians have always said about the word and its validity, or about human nature for that matter. Because again, the human being in the human sciences, or the Geisteswissenschaft, is predicated on a human nature who's only Geist, just spirit, no body. And it leads to a sort of a Gnostic view of human nature, with a unsurprising sort of secular priesthood who have a secret knowledge that they can't disseminate to others and can't explain, etc., etc. But they have a what they say has to be obeyed because they are the scientists, after all. And how are we mere mortals to understand them, or who are we to disagree with them?